Welcome from the Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Management Program at Columbia Business School. I'm Bunny Ellerin, the director, and really pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, which will be incredibly interesting and valuable. I wanted to introduce our moderator, Lorraine Marchand, who's also an alumna of Columbia Business School. Lorraine has been an important part of the Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Management Program for many years. She's an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School and teaches a terrific course on global health. And by day, she is at IQVIA as a principal consultant in the R&D space. So I'm going to turn it over to Lorraine, and thank you all for tuning in.
Well, thank you, Bunny, and HPM for hosting this important talk. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker and today's topic of new approaches to COVID-19, the role of data and analytics. One housekeeping item, this meeting is being recorded, and at the end, after about 30 minutes of Nancy's speaking, we will take Q&A. So if you could use the Q&A box on your Zoom feature panel and not the chat box, that would be terrific. The media has likened COVID to the bubonic plague in 1347 and the Italian Renaissance that followed, making the point that widespread tragedies may usher in economic, cultural, and even healthcare transformations. While this may be a dramatic metaphor, the pandemic has ushered in a new wave of innovation and set the stage for new solutions in healthcare diagnosis, delivery, supply chain, and therapeutic research. Likewise, we have an unprecedented opportunity to explore and apply clinical trial and real-world data and use its power to help us understand, manage, and respond to COVID and hopefully future pandemics. In the spirit of exploring both innovation in data and analytics and new solutions made possible through insights from data, we welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Nancy Dreyer. Nancy is the Chief Scientific Officer and SVP at IQVIA. She's also an adjunct professor of epidemiology at the University of North Carolina School of Global Public Health. At IQVIA, Nancy oversees real-world evidence generation for regulators, clinicians, patients, and payers through pragmatic randomized trials and non-interventional studies. Nancy is widely known for creating the GRACE checklist, the only validated checklist for measuring the quality of observational studies of comparative effectiveness. She is senior author of 4 editions of the publication Registries for Evaluating Patient Outcomes, a User's Guide, published by the U.S. Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Nancy has authored more than 100 publications in peer-reviewed journals. She is a fellow of the International Society of Pharmacoepidemiology and DIA. In 2018, Nancy was appointed to the U.S. Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute's Clinical Trials Methods Advisory Panel. And one of my favorite accomplishments of Nancy is that she is a long-standing consultant to the U.S. National Football League Health and Safety Executive Committee. And on the more personal side, one of Nancy's greatest prides is that she is a grandmother, and one of the items that her family attributes to her is that she's a great cook. So we're very happy to welcome Nancy to the HPM seminar series today. She's going to talk a little bit about her professional career and trajectory, what she has seen as far as other viral epidemics, and then talk with us about the future of COVID-19 and solutions and innovations that are going to better help us manage this epidemic and others in the future. Nancy, welcome.
Thanks very much. Just checking on the audio. Can you give me a thumbs up, Lorraine? You hear me okay?
Yes, Nancy.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I really wish I was in a room together talking with you so I could look in your faces. And I'm not about to invite you all over for dinner, but thanks for the pitch, Lorraine. Let me get down to it. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then a little bit about my research interests in COVID-19 and the serious adverse respiratory syndrome related to it. And then people always say, when is it going to be over? So I have just something wanted to share with you on that topic. So by way of introduction, I am jealous of you all. I think I'm a business school wannabe. But when I graduated, and you could tell by Lorraine's long list of my achievements that I've been doing this a long time. When I got out of college, I was of the generation where you could be a teacher or a nurse, and discovered late that I didn't want to be a teacher, or certainly not an elementary school teacher. So I got a job. The first job I could get was at a local hospital. And it was because I could type, but it was a research program, an epidemiologic research program on diethylstilbestrol, which was known as the better baby drug until, of course, it wasn't. And it was such an interesting medical mystery where a sharp doctor figured that he was seeing a lot of a very rare form of vaginal cervical cancer, and actually led to the detection of the root cause, which was something that women had used during pregnancy. So talk about a delayed adverse reaction, but an important one. Because you guys have an appreciation for business, I'll just share my business background, because I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I'm very proud of that. Early on, I decided to run a summer school, and was thinking that you could do that without having an academic affiliation, because I didn't have an academic affiliation, and people said you couldn't. But I did found the New England Epidemiology Institute, which was a summer program that ran for 20 years, and trained a lot of people from around the world. But as a business idea, we found that there were academic centers, like we started at University of Massachusetts in Western Mass, beautiful countryside, empty largely in the summer. So we were able to get to rent hotel rooms, dorm rooms, teaching rooms, and then they liked our course so much, we became accredited by them. And I was in a position to look around the world and pick the best teachers on the best topics and make it a revolving, ever-changing, continuing education program from year to year, which eventually became accredited by several universities, both in the U.S. and Europe. And that is a picture of my husband and I, he was a teacher and I was running it the first year. The business, when we started this, my lawyer was saying to me, was helping us get business, saying, you should have a bigger purpose. Maybe you'll want to be a research company. And in the course of planning the summer school and launching it, the small business I was working for went out of business. So I became a research firm. And these are just two of the accomplishments from that firm. I'm very proud of what I'm showing you, my first publication in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And it was really about ethics and publication rights, and that you don't have to be a major university. And in fact, business, if you set that out as a policy, can adhere to publications and sharing of information sometimes easier than academic centers. We also started a scientific journal, which is still in publication. If any of you read epidemiology, another example where they said you can't do that unless you're an association, which we weren't. But I had a great editor and a company that was able to fund this, getting this off the ground. So it's now, its first issue was in 1990, so it's done very well. And it's really exciting when you can do things that have enduring value like that. Just to wrap up the entrepreneurial part of the story, I ran that business for 20 years and then just had enough and was fortunate to sell it to United Health. It became their drug safety group because we had done a lot of database research. And after a couple years at United Health, I was wooed away by an entrepreneur from Harvard Medical School, shown in that picture with me, Dr. Richard Glicklick. Rich had formed the first spinoff from Harvard Medical School called Outcome Sciences, which was a technology company, and he brought me in to put the science in Outcome Sciences. The picture is from the day we actually grew the business so much so that we realized it needed a bigger structure, and we looked for a partner, and he sold it to Quintiles, and the then president of Quintiles sent his private jet for us. So it was exciting in a lot of different ways. I missed an important part of the story, which is in 2016, I helped lead the merger of Quintiles and IMS Health to form the company known as IQVIA, where Lorraine and I work. But she did mention some of these books that we wrote, these 2 user guides, wrote them at Outcome Sciences, and they really have been helping shape both patient registries, which were, when I started this in 2007, not well known, and now they are, and then using real-world data for comparative effectiveness seemed a radical idea then. So we were commissioned to write a book just about the methods, and it's become ever more important. So now I got to IQVIA, and it's a lot of fun. So let's talk about pandemic research. This actually is not my first pandemic experience. I should tell you that by training, I come out of the social sciences, not the medical sciences. So this, like every project, has been a lot of studying on the fly and project specific. But in 2006, I was hired by Hoffman La Roche. And this was just at the outbreak of what was worried to be that it would become a major pandemic. It was the H5N1 avian flu epidemic. Now, this just as background, I know coronavirus is bad, but this H5N1, the bird flu, the median time to death from first symptom, so first sniffle, fever, the median time to death was 9 days. So incredibly quick, incredibly lethal. I think one of the reasons it never became a pandemic is it was too efficient a killer, and people didn't survive long enough to spread the disease. But Hoffman La Roche had a popular anti-influenza drug, Tamiflu, which I bet most of you know. It had just come on the market and been approved for seasonal influenza. It shortened the symptoms a little bit. And they said, we don't know, it's not approved for H5N1, so we're not asking you to study Tamiflu, but just see what you can learn from every known case in the world to help foster understanding of the natural history. And again, we couldn't study people who died at home before they never came to any medical attention. But if they did, we tried to go around the world and find all the case records, review them with the help of translators, understand how they were treated, and see what, if anything, would enhance their chance of survival. Now, I'm telling you this story because I think it has important lessons for coronavirus. And I want to show you this table. So this is H5N1. If you look at the left-hand column, I want you to keep this in mind. If there's one thing you remember from this talk, remember that treatments perform differently in highly lethal infectious diseases according to when you get the treatment. So remember, Tamiflu for seasonal flu, the label says you have to take it within 48 hours of symptom onset. Now, just holding aside the difficulty of going to the doctor, getting an appointment, getting enough of a diagnosis to get a prescription filled in 48 hours is high. But that was the background. What we found in this, so first of all, this registry put together information on 2/3 of the world's known cases. We went to 13 countries and reviewed medical records. And what we found is a lot of people use Tamiflu. And if they got it to you quickly, if you look at that relative risk of survival where I've got the yellow circle, if you got it within 2 days, it quadrupled your chance of survival. So that was a surprise and nice. But the next two rows I thought were equally surprising and nice, because what it showed is that even if you didn't get your first dose till even 6 to 8 days after your first symptoms, it still almost doubled your chances of survival. So that it showed that as the virus was replicating, it still at that midpoint was effective in calming it down and shutting things off. But if you look down at the bottom two rows, 9 to 11 days or after 12 days, it's too hard to shut off the cytokine storm and the extent of damage that the disease is already wreaking on your body. So you can have an effective treatment that works earlier in the disease, and you need different treatments. So what you see in hospital, for example, may not be useful in prophylaxis. So I want you to keep that in mind. Let's go on to COVID-19, because that's what we're all thinking about. So here what I'm trying to do is use that same knowledge about patient registries and updated for 2020 and how we go about using the tools, but seeing what we can find out about what people can do to either protect themselves or to lessen the effects of an infection if you get it. So the idea that we'll all be able to stay home and isolated forever, I think you'll all agree is unrealistic. So we know we'll open up. So how can we figure out what factors will mitigate the effects of it? I'm also interested in, are there current drugs on the market that could be repurposed? So that was the Tamiflu example in H5N1. Wasn't approved, didn't have this label, but the concept of repurposed drugs are you take an approved drug and you find a new indication for it. Time-honored strategy, a whole lot of pressure during a pandemic like this. We're also looking to see if there are leads for new candidates and if we have any hints on how do you prioritize that. And most important, really understanding who's at risk. I know you all read some newspapers and have some sources of news, and I'm feel confident that we all share the same frustration of one day there's a risk factor, the next day it's something else, the third day everything changes, and we don't really know how to protect ourselves, and we don't know who's at most risk, other than perhaps some simple guides like people elderly. Now, when you look at the dashboards, and I didn't have the courage to update this. You all can update it, but you look at the death toll, you look at the global toll of disease. It totally makes sense that all our efforts have started to understand effective treatment in hospital. After all, you want to know if you get that sick and what can you do to survive. So that's where the bulk of the research is. But now we're starting to see studies like this. And this is just one, but there are others like this where they did a systematic screening of everyone who came into a clinic. And there's another one I saw, which was a systematic screening of everybody in a homeless shelter. And the two messages from both of those studies show that there are a lot of people who appear to be infected with COVID-19 who are asymptomatic, or perhaps in the case of the homeless shelter, they are the symptoms from the coronavirus pale in comparison to the other burden they're facing in life. But the message I took away from this is not everybody who's exposed gets sick, and is there something that we can learn from them? So I'm proud that IQVIA actually launched a registry all on its own. So this is no funding from a pharmaceutical company or any government. But the idea is to use the registry kind of approach. In this case, we decided to go direct to the community because there's so much research about hospitals, and there's a ton of medical record resources we can use to study people who can come for ambulatory care. But a lot of people like me are staying home, and my children and my grandchildren, and I'm sure your families, they're not going for medical care. Is there something we can learn about looking directly in the community? So you can see on the screen the URL, helpstopcovid19.com. Be delighted if anybody wants to help and participate in this research. And if you want to see the protocol, I gave you the number for clinicaltrials.gov. But basically, it's a descriptive study of people who've been exposed or think they've been exposed to COVID-19. And we're looking at factors that will explain, hopefully, why they seem to have more symptoms or fewer symptoms. So we're looking at their prescription meds, their non-prescription meds. There's a lot of interest these days in vitamins and minerals, so vitamin D, zinc, some interest in herbals. Lately, I heard about an interest in the MMR vaccine because there's some theories that show there might be cross-protection. But now all this, of course, has to be taken into consideration in the context of your underlying health conditions. So we ask a little bit about that. And then we also want to try to get a gauge of your exposure. So we ask you if you've been tested, but we all know that particularly in the United States, there's not a lot of testing. So we're also asking about jobs like, are you an essential healthcare worker or a frontline healthcare worker or grocery delivery, and things that give you more community exposure than other people like me who are staying at home. What's unique about this is a focus on symptoms. So most everything else in terms of research that's being done now is done on the SARS, so serious acute respiratory syndrome from COVID-19 that gets you in the hospital, or other things that drive you to the doctor. This is about symptoms that bother you whether or not you go to the doctor. And being a condition registry or disease registry, it allows you to evaluate many different research ideas. So the way it works is we invite a pretty broad participation. Pretty much anyone who has not been cloistered is, if you ever go out or have people come into your home who've been out, you're eligible for this research. We are now starting to adapt this for certain workforces to try to study return to work features, so it can work on that as well. But basically the concept, I'm not going to take you through every data element, but I just wanted to show you the concept here. It's a baseline survey, so like a marketing survey. So you go, if you want to participate and respond to us, you go online and answer as many questions as you can or as you like. At the end of the survey, it then asks if you'd be willing to be contacted for follow-up and participate in follow-up studies. So what happens at that point is we know that you have to be respectful of people's times. And there are plenty of good studies that come at you every hour or every day. How are you feeling now? How are you feeling now? How are you feeling now? And people burn out. So our attempt to deal with that is that for the first month, we contact you every 3 days. You have a little chance to recover, but you start to be more interested perhaps in responding. So every 3 days for the first month, and then every 2 weeks for the next 2 months. Now, this was an arbitrary 3-month period. There's no right or wrong length of time, and it could be extended. But you can see that we're trying to find your medical risk factors. We're constantly fine-tuning it, so we're trying to add more of the facts that we are interested in, and a lot about symptoms. I think we recently added COVID toes, which was a new thing. But so the key factor is this is studying symptoms. The second key factor is that ability to be recontacted for follow-up also allows us to drive special questions. For example, there's some new research coming out about antihistamines. And there are some other questions that I'd like to be able to ask specifically. So we may send out special surveys because we don't ask you your life history and your entire medication history because it's easy for people to get tired of responding. So we had to look for that right balance. Another important and unique factor is this alternate contact. So when you sign up and agree to give us your contact information, we also ask if you would name someone else we can contact just in case we can't get rid of you. Could be next of kin, could be best friend, but think about it. we only use this once at the end of our survey period if we've lost you. First, we give you some reminders in case you skipped one, come back in. But this is a simple way of finding out if you've died, if the participant is dead, or if they're in the hospital and unable to respond, or maybe they just got tired of it. But having that backup person has attracted a lot of interest, because it's hard to find out if people have died through existing records. And if you die in the hospital, they know it. If you get discharged from the hospital, go home, and then die, it's not always noted in the hospital record. So that actually turns out to be an important feature. Now, you could imagine how important protecting patient privacy is. We happen to, IQVIA is a big company listed on the stock exchange, but whether you're big or small, patient privacy is important. And for us, the exposure is just incredibly important. So this is very heavily protected. But we built it on what they call an agile data hub technology that allows us to link it with a variety of other information. So, for example, we're helping a large organization that I'm not able to name today with a back to work effort where we need to actually have temperature screening and a variety of daily monitoring, which we will do with LinkedIn technology that supports, that all gets fed into this data hub. Similarly, if we may do some research, we'll ask people if selected participants, for example, perhaps they'll be willing to contribute serum, and in which case we could do some analyses and link that. Also, when I was telling you a little bit about the genesis of IQVIA, which was the merger of Quintiles and IMS Health, IMS had lots and lots of contracts with the medical record companies and pharmacies, so we're able to, through secure encryption, provide some linkage from our participants who give us the right, give us their private information. We are able, in an anonymized way, to actually link with some other data like outpatient pharmacy or ambulatory care. So it's another way to increase the validity of what you have. But this is what it looks like. If you look on the left, people ask me if it's an app. It's not an app. It's, you can log onto this from your phone, from your pad, from your ThinkPad, or your tablet, or your big screen, and it's customized to display well. And what you see on the right are some of the up-to-date or near real-time reports you'll see if you go to the website. And then if you become a participant, we're designing even more reports for you there. So here's just the structure. You can see on the left of this, the general population, or maybe you're an employed group, or we've got some patient advocacy groups that are helping us with recruitment. And you come into this central hub where we collect this information. We will be able to link some people, but not all. And then we'll have custom reporting depending on the contributor and what kind of contribution and what information they need to know. So we've been talking with some state health departments about how to monitor things in a particular state, as well as businesses. We're talking to the FDA about how to do some analyses to try to figure out what factors protect or enhance your risk. So we're just starting the data curation and analysis phase. You're welcome to come look on the website. This is what the reminder of the URL. We have something on the order of 20,000 participants. And if you log on, you'll see the map. I'm happy to say that we've got reporting from all 50 states. And in fact, we're about to launch in the UK, I think next week. And then after that, we're just undergoing our ethics review in Germany. So those 2 additional countries will be added. But that's where we are now. I think that's what I have on COVID. Lorraine, we could break for questions, or I could talk a little bit more about what's next. What would you like?
Well, if you have everyone, I think Nancy is interested in the headlines in terms of what's next. So why don't you make those comments, and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Okay, when's it going to be over? So I'm not telling you when it's going to be over. But I saw this figure and it really just stuck in my mind about the fact that we need to think bigger than just COVID-19, because this has started a whole cascade of effects that we're going to see in our health systems. So, first we have this very active, very serious mortality. In many places, we're starting to see the numbers come down. So that's a relief. But there's still strains on the healthcare system and some of the delayed recovery. There's also questions about what happens when you've been on a respirator for 30 days and you go home. What kind of a life do you have? And then there are the second wave and the third wave are interesting as the fourth too. So what we see now is we see a delay in any kind of screening healthcare. So particularly people screening for cancer is way down. People are postponing therapies they're postponing infusion therapies. So that's not just chemo for cancer, but there are a lot of good biologics that are administered by infusion because people are worried about the risk of going in the hospital. So the fact that you will have under treatment of serious chronic diseases and I think acute diseases will cause a spike in other conditions. So that's the second and third wave, so the interrupted care issue. And then we cannot neglect the burnout. The tough effect on all our healthcare workers of dealing with this monumental caseload, the lack of effective protective equipment, or not even knowing the full extent of what they should be protecting them against, and then just how long they can keep up a pace like this. So those were my comments, Lorraine. I'm happy to open this up to discussion, however you guys like to take this next.
Nancy, thank you. I think that was a terrific overview. You covered a lot of important points and shared some valuable information. As we go to the Q&A, one question I'd like to ask you to address is, can you talk a little bit about more of the use cases? I know you mentioned the FDA, you mentioned a large employer, and how the data from the registry will be used by some of those stakeholders. But could you perhaps explain a little bit more, for example, by biopharma companies, med tech companies, others, payers, what other stakeholders might be using this data and what other use cases could be relevant?
Well, thanks for asking. Let's start at the tail end and come back. I think in the pharmaceutical industry, there are lots of trials launched about treatments and vaccines, right? We're all waiting for the vaccine. But there was an interesting editorial in yesterday's Wall Street Journal by Scott Gottlieb and an associate, just talking about the safety pressures from rushing vaccines to market. So the value of rushing to vaccines to market is that we can all go out sooner. Of course, the safety concerns we're worried about with any new vaccine, but certainly ones that are rushed to market is, are they protective and are they safe? So I think that we need the question is, how good is our long-term follow-up? It is, for example, in the U.S., the voluntary safety reporting system sufficient? I don't know. I know they've invested a lot in it, and it's an important source. But I'm an epidemiologist. I like systematic data collection. I would like to see some long-term follow-up, specifically for people who've received experimental vaccines. And you could do that through a backbone like this technology, but you could do it anyway. But how are they doing 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later? The same with any experimental treatments. The idea that we do randomized clinical trials is great for figuring out if new drugs work and if they're safe and effective. But I'm always interested in delayed effectiveness and safety as well, because I come out of a drug safety background. So I think that we're going so fast and furious that I want to make sure that we put in those long-term follow-ups just to be able to quantify what happens, because things always happen to people. And you don't know if it was the drug or the vaccine, so you need the comparators, and you need large enough data sets to know if this is a very, very rare effect or it's something more common. So the long-term follow-up I'm really keen on. On the other side of drug development, there's a lot of interest in trying to look at data like you've seen from this registry, but also other registries or other sources of information where you can try and figure out, are there clues for who we should be studying? So who's at highest risk, or who doesn't seem to be at risk, or do we need to know about school-age populations so we can really see what their vulnerability is now? So there are a lot of subgroups that we need to know about. And so we see interest from biopharmaceutical companies in trying to understand this type of a population, but also other ambulatory care data to see who's coming in and why and what's wrong with them. So I think we see that. I think the public health perspective on, I started this talk, there's more than just track and trace. Track and trace is very important and has been extremely successful in other states, but it'll always be limited by our ability to track and trace. So we need more than that. So I think the idea that governments and states and organizations may want to track their communities to understand as they open up, are they doing it safely enough? Because I think we could agree that most of the rules we hear about are kind of arbitrary. What do you say, 6 feet apart? Does that mean 6.5 feet's better? Does it mean 5.5 feet? You're going to be dead. It's hard to know. Do you need a face shield all the time? All those questions. So I think there's a lot of monitoring just in the general return to work. And then Lorraine, you mentioned in the introduction about that I do work in professional sports, elite sports, and we want to have playoffs. We want to continue sports. Now we've seen Indy car racing without anybody in the audience. Few problems. We'll see whether NFL and NBA go back and how they do it. But I think there's a lot of concern first for players just coming together for games. You can't have players distance on the field. They're going to get respiratory they're going to get blown on, they're going to get spit on, they're going to be in the locker room together. What about the staff? What about the medical staff, the coaching staff? When can you let fans in? What do you need for fans? All those things, we want to return to normal. And I think we need the data to be guiding that. I don't want to turn ourselves into guinea pigs, but we want to be able to look and know.
Nancy, we have a question from the audience that's going to take us a few feet above where we've been talking at this point. But okay, what about the future of public-private partnerships in order to develop protocols and ways to handle potential global pandemics like this in the future? What are you seeing? What would you like to see? Are there signs that organizations are coming together now to prepare for the future?
There are a lot of exciting signs. So first of all, I work in a global business. So I'll tell you what I can see in some of the different regions. So the United States, for example, the FDA has been phenomenal in driving what they've been calling evidence accelerators. So they have put together, it's not a formal public-private partnership, but it's the groundwork for these partnerships because they have, following work that they have done with the Reagan-Udall Foundation, with Sentinel, with Friends of Cancer Research, they're pulling together organizations like IQVIA and others that have access to large amounts of medical records and trying to get research done where we take a research question and execute it using a common protocol, but in different settings. So we don't combine the data, but this way we'll get, Columbia Presbyterian in New York, Mass General in Boston, such and such in other cities, and see if we're seeing the same patterns everywhere. So we've been starting this with the 21st Century Cures Act and efforts to modernize our drug regulation systems. And the FDA has really put the pedal to the metal for COVID-19 in terms of trying to drive research. Now, ours is unusual because it's systematic research driven by scientists of the non-medicalized population. And it's hard to sift through all the initiatives going on to figure out what will shape them. But we are seeing now in England, we were approached by the British government to help them because they knew we were a large organization that had a ready infrastructure. So we were helping them actually conduct the clinical trials that they've been thinking of, including some of this work from Oxford. We're also helping them with a national, very large-scale screening program with temperatures and symptoms, and maybe trying to link that. But remember where I started the story on this is an aside, but it's a beef of mine, and if you're a captive audience, I'll be quick. But remember I started talking about Tamiflu and the idea of repurposed drugs? Turns out we can do that kind of examination really well in the United States, but some of the laws in other countries, for example, restrict you from studying drugs outside their indication. So, for example, we had to change the German version of our protocol to not look at prescription drugs outside of their indication because that's against the law. In other European countries, we've been told that we can do broad-scale screening and look at a variety of drugs. But if we do something that would be considered a specific study, so take an antihistamine. If we wanted to study antihistamines, then we would have to do safety reporting of anything that might be considered an adverse event, which is everybody in the registry who has a symptom. And then you would have to tell that it might be caused by any drug, prescription or not, used by that person in the registry. And just look what's in your medicine cabinet, or look what you took with breakfast, and whether it was prescription pills, or you took ibuprofen, or you took your allergy meds because of the season. Could imagine what a huge amount of reporting that would be, and you wouldn't be able to make anything of it. So those things make you say, wait a minute, I'm not going to look at those because the reporting burden is too high. So something seems to be wrong on the regulatory side of that. But
okay.
But the public partnership, what we hear a great interest in the public agencies. I think we also see. I feel impatient. I bet you feel impatient. But when I talk to my colleagues at the FDA and other agencies, they are overwhelmed by questions they can't answer, and they're overwhelmed by basic questions about drug supply and equipment and personnel that they need for the most serious patients. And then the questions that, the FDA gets every day, like, is hydroxychloroquine good or bad? They don't have the information to answer that yet.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, one of the panelists, I don't know if you have anything further to elaborate on that point, but clearly public fatigue with COVID, the containment efforts, which, as you mentioned, one day we're doing masks, another day we're doing something different. Some states are rolling out in green. So how do the public health officials think about balancing their protocols for containment while we're still collecting this research and data? What is the right way to iterate the data and the findings in a way that can impact the public health and these containment procedures in a way that's relevant and timely?
Well, that's a pretty big question, Lauren. I think it's the big question. And so first of all, I'm a scientist. I believe in data-driven policies whenever possible, because the data are often different from what I expect them to be. And I learned that as a business person and as a scientist. So both of those data was often a surprise and very important part of shaping opinion. I think that the issues facing people are that they don't know who to trust and what to trust. For example, as it's probably apparent, I read the Wall Street Journal. You look in today's article, there's an editorial about a big study published in Lancet where they think there seems to be a lot of evidence to suggest that the data may be fraudulent entirely because it was, it just fails a lot of plausibility checks. How it got into the Lancet, I don't know. But it's an example of where, and this was something where they put together what they said were big data by a very tiny company from places that don't share their data, and in some cases, more cases than exist. So there are a lot of flags, but I think it's very difficult the Lancet examples are difficult for an editor to separate fact from fiction. Imagine you have a job in a health department. Who do you turn to? And what we see are a lot of people either don't know how to evaluate what they see or don't know how to take into account how much research is driven by commercial or political agendas. Maybe that's the best way to put it. Because we see it's hard to do balanced research. And it's hard to do good real-world research because what we see the FDA trying to do, again, going back to 21st Century Cures Act and the new law that's driving modernization of drug approval in the United States, the FDA has its criteria that it's developing, it's not finished yet, for evaluating real-world evidence depend both on the data quality and the methods used, the study design methods used. So it's not something that your high school kid will do for a science project and come up with some new finding, most likely. There's actually a lot of training involved. So the study design and data quality issues, as well as the thoroughness and the systematic evaluation, all this stuff is driven by an analytic plan declared in advance. This is what I'm looking for, and this is how I got here, and this is what I found, and replication. So we're on the right process, but I think it's very difficult for public health agencies to know who to trust and what to trust, and they get in trouble for whatever they do. Either they went with a big company and they should have gone with a small company, or they went with a company when they should have gone with a nonprofit, and it's just very difficult.
Nancy, one of our audience members noted earlier in the talk, you referenced some of the prevention studies are underway other than people staying at home, such as yourself and your family. Do we have any early findings from any of these studies that you're aware of?
I think what we could look largely and say that we've seen that when people began to self-isolate, the spread decreased. That there doesn't seem to be any dispute about. But there's very little information on how much people are isolating and how they're isolating. So we don't know what makes it effective. That's the whole question. We ask that really intrigues me. I mean, we ask people some questions here about isolation, but also, do you go out? Do you have any, do you live with people that you're not related to? Do any people you live with, related or not, go out to work and come home? This is about as complex as it gets. So I haven't seen anything convincing on the prophylactic side. Probably the most interesting thing I saw came to my desk today about MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines. And there's some thinking that there's cross-protection. Now, this is an ecological study, so it compares Hong Kong and New York City. Hong Kong, they gave out free vaccines to kids for a long time, but now they started increasing those vaccines to adults. And they have a much, much lower death rate than New York City, which was put forth as a city of equal size. or similar size, which didn't have such a widespread adoption of this vaccination. So interesting, huh?
And on that point, the MMR is possibly a good example. One of the audience members would like you to help paint a picture. What sort of transformation or change would you envision could come out of the data in this platform? I guess if you had a wish list, what types of big questions would you like it to be able to answer? Maybe it's things like that MMR example that you just gave. But can you paint a picture for the audience?
Well, the vaccine is one example, but I'm really interested in the role of vitamins and minerals in combination, or with or without medicines. So in talking to regulators around the world, what has gotten them excited about this project is, first of all, it studies symptoms, but second of all, it studies non-prescription drugs, which there's very little systematic information about, as well as vitamins and minerals, which there's pretty much none. So, some of if anyone was interested in the hydroxychloroquine data when it first came out, what I understood is that it worked best in combination with zinc. And the concept was that the hydroxychloroquine opened the cell up so that the zinc could get in and do its work. But without the hydroxychloroquine or other chloroquine, the cell could not absorb the zinc. And then so zinc administered alone doesn't do it, but in combination seemed to do it. Now, obviously, that needs to be studied further. And the next question, is it only hydroxychloroquine that can condition the cell? So, and then the new questions about antihistamines, that they actually, some thinking they may be protective. This is going to be one of the few kinds of data sources, I think, that we could really study that. So the idea of these drugs we may already have in our cabinets, or these vitamins and minerals that we all think are going to be helpful, but there's not a lot of systematic evidence on vitamins and minerals because there's usually not the commercial potential for them or coordination to drive that. This will be a nice opportunity to see if it's 1-2 makes the difference.
And I guess what the protective factor is for these 25% of patients, or average of 25%, who are asymptomatic, right? Would be another area of interesting study.
Absolutely. But maybe some of these factors will show you why they're asymptomatic.
Nancy, we have additional questions on how one can access the data in the registry, more questions about your career. With the 7 minutes left, I wanted to, if the audience is okay, continue to stay with the COVID-related questions since we have Nancy with us, and we'll certainly be happy to get back to those of you who've asked some other questions. But we have a question, I think it's really important. There's been a lot of discussion of late around the increased prevalence of COVID in the Black community and what can be done about it. And so a question is around, will this platform help us better understand COVID in certain ethnic communities? Will it help us answer some questions of what's happening in Black communities, for example?
So glad you asked that, and I wish I'd mentioned it sooner. We do ask a lot of questions about ethnicity, and it's not straightforward reporting. But I think my hope is that this will allow us to start to decouple ethnicity from underlying health conditions, for example. So there's a lot of questions, for example, is what we are some of these hypotheses perhaps related to body mass, to height and weight issues, or is it an ethnicity issue? And you just don't know because we just don't have enough information yet.
Okay, very good. And Nancy, since we have just a few minutes left, would you be able to address if someone is interested in possibly accessing the data in the CARE registry, how they might do that?
Yes, please. I think if I haven't shared my email, I shall. But you're welcome to write to me. I don't know if we have a contact us box through the registry, but we may. But we are delighted. We are looking to harness the value of academic and other researchers and their energies to try to make sense out of this. And we are developing our first curated data set that we'll be making available. There is a small application process, no fee, but the application, you have to declare what it is that you want to study, your hypothesis, and we have to check to see if we have the data and the like. But we would be delighted to hear from you.
And Nancy, on this question of career, we can wrap up where we started, which is your brilliant career and your many contributions to public health. Do you have any words of wisdom for those on their career trajectory of all of the experiences that you've had and case studies that you might reference? What pearls of wisdom do you have as for someone that's starting or midpoint of their career?
Oh, I want to offer you nothing but encouragement and tell you that don't be limited by your self-doubts or feeling you may not know enough or you may not be good enough for any job. I mean, I was a sociology major, which basically undergrad, got me, prepared me for nothing. And then I thought I would, when I got to public health school, I thought I would study social research. And then I started looking at other things that were so much more powerful. Doesn't take away the value of the social research, but every time I get a new research program, it's like, holy cow! You have to be open to learn new things, and you have to go out and learn those things. There's a responsibility on you, but it makes you sharper, smarter, opens up your thinking. I've gotten more jobs than you could ever imagine because I had no particular experience in the field and they were highly contentious fields. Now that sounds ridiculous, I know. But the point is, if you are serious about your work, hardworking, try to get input from people who you think are smarter than you or knowledgeable. The sky's the limit. So I say go for it.
Yes, never
but
accept no.
Not in a half-hearted way. It's got to be an all or none, all in. That makes the best.
Okay. Well, Nancy, I think it's been a terrific session. Anything that you would like to leave as a parting word? I know the last time that we had a leadership discussion back in January, and I asked you what was next, what was the next big thing that you were going to conquer. I think it was in the realm of social media, and we certainly didn't have a crystal ball to know that COVID was going to strike. So I would imagine that this is going to be a problem that will be keeping you and certainly IQVIA busy for the next future.
As will all of us. This was certainly a transformative experience for the world in how we do business, how we do research, how we conduct our lives. So I appreciate that. I hope you all appreciate that you're getting this wonderful training that will make you sharper, and you'll learn from case studies and everything you study in school about what worked or didn't work for others, and it's going to be up to you to put those lessons to work. No pressure.
Well,
Counting on you.
Thank you, all of our listeners, Bunny, Bianca, HPM, thank you for sponsoring this discussion. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Nancy's been kind enough to share her email address. I'm happy to share mine as well. So if there are questions that we haven't been able to get to, please find a way to follow up and we'd be happy to respond. And Nancy, again, a big thank you to you for being with us this past hour and sharing your insights and experience and what we can expect in the future.
And thanks so much for giving me this chance and this opportunity. I want to wish you all good luck and hope you stay healthy.